Hey, Fatty, thanks for joining me on mic real quick here.
Hi, how are you doing, Hottie?
Hi.
Hey, you woke me from my hibernation. What's going on?
Yeah, well, I've been monitoring the Facebook participants page, as you have, and a lot of members there have been wondering what is happening with us and the show as well. And I just thought it'd be a good idea to hop on and say hi to everyone and let them know we're still alive.
Hi, everyone. We are still alive.
Yeah, right. And while we're recording, you think we could give that hungry bunch a little something they could use in their Leadville planning and preparation?
I absolutely think we should. I mean, this show has always been about knowledge sharing. So let's count it down. Fire that shotgun.
3, 2, 1.
Leadville, the podcast for the 100-mile mountain bike race presented by Shimano. This, of course, is the show that breaks down, builds up, gets you ready, freaks you out for the highest, hardest one-day mountain bike race in the country. I'm Michael Hottie, Hottie to most.
And I'm Eldon Nelson, Fatty on the show and at the finish line. Folks, we apologize for the delay in getting back to you as you get ready for the 2025 Leadville Trail 100. We know many of you are deep into your training plans, so we wanted to jump in here and give you at least a little something that might help get you ready.
Yeah, funny thing, Fatty, the interview in this show is something we gathered at last summer's race, so we've been kind of sitting on it for a while here. At the time of recording, we didn't know what we would do with it, but the opportunity was too good to pass up.
Yeah, two of the most important recurring themes on this show have been fueling and hydration. It's an eating and drinking contest disguised as a bicycle race after all. So let's delve in one more time into the hydration half of this equation.
Yeah, how much you sweat and what is in that sweat is a big part of your hydration strategy. At last year's Leadville, we literally got hooked up with the folks at Precision Fuel and Hydration to get some answers on sodium losses through sweat. Now, the company had brought their sweat testing machine to Leadville, and I was the guinea pig. They hooked me up and made me sweat. While samples were being drawn, we asked company CEO and founder Andy Blow about the test and how Leadville athletes can dial their hydration and sodium needs. Okay, we're back with Andy Blow. Andy was on the Leadville podcast, at least, earlier this season, talking about Neutral Aid and the gels you'll have in Neutral Aid. Andy, we wanted to circle back with you here at Leadville on something that you've spent a lot of time researching and looking into, and that's the idea of sweat rate and what is in our sweat as it comes pouring out of our bodies when we're in a hard event. Now, your staff here tells me that this all started not because you had an idea, but you personally had a problem. Is that correct?
100%. Yeah, I was an endurance athlete. I still am. Probably not as much of an endurance athlete as I used to be, but still having a go these days. I was mainly racing in triathlon, but I dabbled with bike racing and quite a bit of running as well. And I had this reoccurring issue of competing in cool conditions and doing really, really well, and then competing in the heat. I would go to Kona, to the Ironman, for example, or go and race in the Far East, in like Thailand or somewhere like that, hot and humid, and my races would fall apart. And I would end up in the medical tent quite often. I had a condition called hyponatremia a couple of times, which is where your blood sodium levels drop dangerously low, and it was a real Achilles heel of mine when I was racing.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're the founder of Precision Fuel and Hydration, and as part of that, you have developed a sweat test that, to my knowledge, is one of the few out there on this level, on the nutrition level, where a company is offering this type of service. So tell us a little bit about the sweat test. How did you come up with it? Where did you find this idea? And is there anything unique about how you do it?
Yeah, so after the problems I was describing to you, getting hyponatremia in races, I was getting very frustrated and actually quite concerned about it as an athlete, because it was affecting my ability to enjoy my sport and potentially my health as well. I spoke to a friend of mine who was a doctor, who's a heart surgeon actually, and communicated to him I had an inclination this had something to do with my sweat, because the problems that I was having were all consistent with the problems people have when they get electrolyte imbalance and fluid imbalance or get very dehydrated. And so he said, well, you lose a lot of, sodium, you lose a lot of salt in your sweat. People in general do, but there's a big variation between people. And he said, I bet if we tested your sweat, we could see how much you're losing and then maybe tailor what you're drinking and eating in races to counteract that a little bit better. And I sort of said, well, yeah, let's do it. Well, how do I get a sweat test? And he said, well, there is, in the medical community, there is a sweat test that already exists, which looks at the amount of salt people lose. And that's for the diagnosis of cystic fibrosis. So I actually got backdoored into a cystic fibrosis clinic, had a sweat test, and sure enough, the doctor was exactly right. My sweat sodium level is really, really high. It's like double what the average person loses. And it was at that point that we changed the regime of what I was drinking in races. We reduced the overall amount of fluid I was taking in, actually, because I was drinking a lot because I have a high sweat rate, but we dramatically increased the amount of salt that I was having, both in the drinks and with the drinks. I used to use sodium capsules, electrolyte capsules back in the day, and we got the ratio to be a lot closer to the kind of levels that I was losing in my sweat. And honestly, Michael, it was like night and day. It was like someone clicked their fingers and all of a sudden, my problems were gone. I was getting cramping horribly before, and I would never ever sort of stand up and say, oh yeah, no, I'm a guy who loves racing in the heat and that's going to be my forte. But it leveled the playing field and meant that, yeah, now I could go and race in the heat. So that's how I found out about the test. And it wasn't for a few years after that I actually was running a sports science lab. I'd retired from racing properly myself and started sweat testing other athletes, that the idea came that actually, well, maybe this is a service and an educational component that endurance athletes everywhere could benefit from. And that was kind of what gave birth to the idea of the company.
Mm-hmm. So I'm actually here at Leadville, currently hooked up to your machine. We're drawing a sample from me to see where I stand, and we're going to reveal the results hopefully near the end of this recording, or at some point we'll reveal the results. Tell us about your machine. How different is this than the one you first saw in a clinic? Yeah,
it's almost identical. We've worked with the manufacturers to produce a specific version for us to use with athletes. So the precision hydration sweat testing machine is made exclusively for us, and it's based on that same technology that is used for the diagnosis of cystic fibrosis to this day. So the big advantage of the equipment we use, there's probably two big advantages, because there are other ways of measuring what's in your sweat. You can put patches over the body, and you can then take those patches off, and you can take the sweat and you can get it analysed at a lab. This is not the only way to do it, but this way we use, what you're undergoing at the moment is sweat induction and sweat collection. So we've used a chemical on the skin to induce your sweat glands to work really, really hard, and then we're collecting the sweat in a little waterproof collector, and we can run it straight through a desktop analyzer and give you an immediate result. And the advantages that have is, one, as you can tell, you're just sat here with me in a chair. You don't have to exercise specifically to do this, which means we can keep the environment very controlled. And secondly, when you use patches and things like that to collect sweat, and then you post-process the sweat, there are opportunities for that sweat to either get contaminated or for some of it to evaporate. And if you get evaporation of sweat, you obviously super concentrate the electrolytes and you get a different reading. So the great thing about this system is it's effectively been medically validated to be very reproducible and produce very accurate results. And so as far as using it with athletes, it's a no-brainer, really. It's a simple system. Right. You told me this is like a 20, 30-minute test, depending. So why don't you give us a brief overview of the steps involved in the test? Yeah, it starts with sweat induction. So that's when we put those two little electrodes on your arm, and they had a gel disc underneath them with a chemical called pilocarpine in. And pilocarpine is an analog for acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter that tells your sweat glands. It's sent down the system from your brain to your sweat glands to tell them when to sweat. So what we've done is we've put a fairly concentrated amount of this neurotransmitter into the skin under that red electrode, and it's tricked the sweat glands there to thinking they need to sweat like you're powering up the climb, here in the heat of the day. We then put a sweat collector on top of that, which is this kind of coil of tubing, which has a tiny little hole in it. And the tubing collects the sweat via capillary action. So it's kind of a passive motion. We collect about 50 microliters of sweat. And then we take that with a syringe and run it through a desktop conductivity analyzer, because obviously electrolytes are charged, they affect the conductivity of the solution, and then we can run it through the analyzer and understand how much sodium you're actually losing in your sweat.
Additionally, it will tell me my sweat rate, correct? Like how much I should be putting in my body on an hourly rate? Can we get that? No, okay.
No, not quite. This is just so the speed at which you fill the collector seems to correlate pretty closely with the magnitude of your sweat rate. So there are lots of reasons why people have different sweat rates: genetics, training status, acclimation status. If you fill the collector reasonably quickly, and you appear to be filling this as we're watching, like reasonably quickly, it indicates a higher sweat rate. If we have people who report very low sweat rates, then this can often take a long time to fill. And but there's still the best way at the moment to measure your sweat rate is to weigh yourself before and after some specific exercise sessions, and that gives you a much more accurate appreciation of what your sweat rate is.
So give us quickly Andy Blow's protocol for measuring sweat rate. What do you like to see an athlete do?
Very simple. Keep your sessions somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes, ideally. Weigh yourself before the session, ideally naked, so you're not wearing any clothing that could collect sweat. You then dress, do your exercise session. Ideally, you don't drink. If you do drink, though, make sure you weigh that so you understand how much you've consumed. Finish your session, strip down, towel down, weigh yourself again, and then that gives you the weight loss that you've experienced in 60 to 90 minutes is almost exclusively going to be fluid. So, and it's if you use the metric system, the maths is easy. 1 kilogram of body weight loss, which is 2.2 pounds, equates to about 1 litre of fluid loss. And you could expect to see, if you're working reasonably hard and it's warm and you're an endurance athlete, if you saw half a kilo, so like 500 millilitres or about 16, 17 ounces of fluid loss, that's going to give you like an hour. That's going to give you a relatively low sweat rate. We would say that you're on the lower side. We've seen athletes go up to like 3.5 litres, which is like well over 100 ounces per hour if they have a really high sweat rate in hot conditions. The average would probably be somewhere between 1 and 1.5 litres per hour for most people.
Gotcha. How much can fitness affect sodium losses and sweat rate?
So sweat rate, fitness can impact it quite a bit. So the fitter you get, generally the better you become at thermoregulating, and the higher your sweat rate becomes. A lot of people would think the opposite. They would think you sweat less, but actually endurance athletes sweat more at a like-for-like intensity, and that's because losing body heat is really, really important for maintaining your performance in hot conditions. And so when you can sweat more, you can cool more effectively. So you will tend to see fitter endurance athletes have higher sweat rates. When it comes to sodium concentration, it's not quite as clear cut. There appears to be a very, very big genetic component to the amount of salt you lose in your sweat. There are some factors that can move that number around a little bit, like the acclimatization status that you're in. If you're more acclimated, your sweat sodium will tend to drop more than anything else. But overall, from all the testing that we've done, and certainly I'm personally one of the most sweat tested people on the planet, because of what I do and because I'm interested in it, and my sweat sodium never moves more than about 5%. So generally your sweat sodium is relatively stable, probably largely set by your genetics, but your sweat rate will move around based on training and acclimation status, and obviously it will move around based on your intensity and the environment you're working out in. The same athlete going easy on a cold day can have a very low sweat rate, but obviously on a hot and humid day when they're working as hard as they can, they're going to have a much higher sweat rate.
So obviously the beauty of your test is it can be placed out in the field. We're sitting here at 10,000 feet in Leadville, and we're doing a test, which is cool. How can people get hooked up doing this test?
So we have a whole bunch of sweat testing centers around the world now. We've been at this for 13 years, and although I would still say education around this topic is not as widespread as maybe it could or should be, we have over 100 sweat test centers now around the world. There's on our website, precisionfuelandhydration.com, you can find a test center. There's a little link. You can click through and put in where you are, and it'll help you find the nearest test centre. People, if they would rather we just help them, they can just email us as well at hello@precisionhydration.com, and we can send you tell us where you are, and we can connect you with a relatively local test centre for you.
And if they can't get hooked up with you for some reason, is there any other thing you would suggest outside of your website and doing that where they could get something more on a clinical level? Where are those places?
There's not too many. Some university institution laboratories, if you contact an exercise physiology department at a facility, they may have the capacity to do sweat testing. I know there are some. I mean, there's specifically in the US over in on the East Coast, the Corey Stringer Institute, which is a specialist centre in Connecticut that looks into heat injuries and heat stress for athletes. They do a lot of sweat testing. So there are a few niche places out there that can do it, but generally speaking, I think the network that we have with Precision Hydration is probably one of the most widespread these days.
Can anecdote tell us anything? Like, for instance, when I sweat and sweat pours down my face and gets in my eyes, it really stings. So much so that I may have to stop and wipe my eyes, right, to get that out of there. Does anecdote tell us anything at all?
It definitely can do. I mean, the reason that I looked into this in the first place was because all of the anecdote for me as a very heavy, salty sweater pointed to the fact that I was probably losing lots and lots. So I had exactly the same thing. Sweat would sting my eyes. It would taste really salty. If I wore black kit on a hot day, I would be fully like salt stained up. So there are a number of telltale signs. The other telltale signs, apart from the physical ones of looking at your sweat itself, you know, how it manifests on your clothing and stuff, on or helmet straps if you're a cyclist, I would say are things like, do you generally kind of feel like you underperform in the heat? Do you get headaches after hard training sessions in the heat, you know, associated with dehydration? The big one I used to get was muscle cramps and also lightheadedness, you know, like basically low blood pressure. When you stand up quickly, you know, we've all got that kind of head rush feeling. Well, I used to experience that a lot after long, hard training sessions, and that's symptomatic of the fact that when you sweat out a lot of fluid and salt, your blood pressure drops because your sweat's coming from your blood plasma. And I remember vividly, you know, like standing up off the couch a couple of times and almost passing out after I'd done a hard training session. And if all of those kind of things seem to speak to you as like, well, yeah, that's how I feel after exercising in the heat, then there's a good chance that maybe, yeah, you are someone who's losing a bit more salt. And experimenting, even without having a test, there's a lot of value in then experimenting with taking more electrolytes with the fluids you're drinking before, during and after exercise to see if it helps.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've developed a whole suite of products here that help address people with whatever issue they might have, whether they be just good and average to heavy, salty sweaters who need a lot of replacement. You've got everything to match their needs? Yeah,
the first product line that we came out with, because as I described, we sort of didn't necessarily go into this to develop a sports nutrition brand. You know, this was a niche consultancy service for silly endurance athletes like us, you know, who wanted to learn a bit more about their body. But what we found was when we started testing people, especially people like me who came out high on the spectrum, they're like, what product should we use? And there wasn't really any product out there that was either A, strong enough at the time, you know, so for people who lose a lot of salt, and B, there was not very clear product labeling to tell people what was in the product. So we developed a very simple range of 4 electrolyte drinks with a low strength 250 milligrams of sodium per litre, a medium 500, a high 1,000 milligrams a litre, and a super strong 1,500 milligrams per litre. And they've really been that's what's, you know, kind of grown the brand over the years, has been the fact that different you know, the fact that you can do a test and then get a fairly strong recommendation immediately as to what is the most appropriate product for you is the simple solution that a lot of people are looking for.
Yeah. Where do you stand on some of the other electrolytes you will see in drinks, like magnesium, potassium, calcium?
All of the electrolytes are really, really important, and they're all important for cellular functioning. They all have different and fluid balance in the body. So potassium, for example, is the predominant intracellular electrolyte versus sodium as the predominant extracellular electrolyte. The fact of the matter is, though, you tend to lose relatively small to microscopic amounts of the electrolytes other than sodium and chloride. And it's predominantly sodium that therefore matters acutely for endurance athletes. All the electrolytes are critical, but you mostly get them in your food. The drinks that we make all have what we would describe as like base amounts of the other electrolytes in, so those that are consistent with what we see in a typical human sweat sample, because there's no harm in replacing them in those quantities, and there may be arguably a marginal benefit, but really the benefit for an endurance athlete is getting your sodium content right in the drinks before and during exercise.
Yeah. And is sodium just sodium? Is my table salt just as good as the stuff I find in your drink mix?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's the body doesn't care really. You know, we tend to use predominantly kind of sodium citrate and sodium carbonate or bicarbonate in the products, because when you're having the stronger products, if you use a lot of sodium chloride, they taste incredibly salty, and that can be off-putting and also make people feel quite sick. So there's good reason to not just use exclusively table salt, and that's particularly when you put it in solution. Like, I don't know if you have ever considered this conundrum, but you can eat very, very salty food and drink water and your stomach feels fine. If you try and put all of that salt into solution, that will probably make you vomit. So you can eat salty food and drink water, or you can use an electrolyte drink, or you can. The key thing is, and we've talked about this before. You need three things when you're doing an endurance event. You need water, you need an appropriate amount of sodium with that water, and you need carbs. And where you get those from, generally speaking, the body's not too fussy. You just got to find that you get them in the right quantities for yourself.
Right. Final question on this, and we'll probably pause and see what my results are, which we're all very excited about here, or at least I am. How about these what do they call them? Pre-hydration, or before an event, you drink a really, really salty drink. I don't know if any of your products addresses that, or if you have a viewpoint on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something which I learned in the process very early on for me, was that going into an event as hydrated as possible is really, really important. And I used to try and achieve that by just drinking tons of water in the days before. And actually that has almost the reverse effect. It makes you pee more and you flush out a lot of electrolytes. So you end up lowering your electrolyte levels before the race, which is disastrous. And there's evidence to support the fact that a lot of athletes do that. You know, before a famous ultramarathon in Greece, researchers took a bunch of blood samples from athletes on the start line and found that like 20% of them were already showing signs of electrolyte depletion. And there's only one reason why that could be, and that's they've drunk too much water in the days leading up. So the counter theory to that is that, unlike carb loading, where you can increase your carbs for days before and stock your body up, you can't do that with water and electrolytes. But what you can do is acutely, kind of the night before and the morning of an endurance event, you can have a very strong salty drink, and then what happens is the salts in that drink go through the gut into the bloodstream. They pull water in with it, and then that stays there and boosts your blood volume temporarily. And if you can get that right, usually the most important dose is having something fairly strong about 60 to 90 minutes before you start, and then that can top off your tanks, make sure your electrolyte levels are not diluted and your blood plasma levels are high. The strength of those drinks is debated. Like the literature suggests that you need very, very strong drinks, like up to say 3,500 milligrams of sodium per litre. But what we've found in practice is that whilst theoretically that does work pretty well, it can cause some it can cause kind of diarrhea and make your stomach feel pretty bad, actually. And not for everyone, but for some people. There's a paper been written that looked at this different strengths of drinks, including one at around 1,500 milligrams a litre, which is the strongest drink that we make. And I think the consensus is, and certainly where we fall on this, is that about 1,500 milligrams a litre is strong, and it's strong enough to have a positive impact on your hydration, but it's also weak enough that it really reduces the risk of gastric upset.
Right.
And so it's kind of a compromised dose, really.
But whether you do that or not, have these pre-event drinks, get on whatever your prescribed sodium to water ratio is right away in your event.
Absolutely.
Don't let that affect what you do during the race.
No, I would say certainly for longer and hotter events. Like, there's a lot of argument in the sports science and nutrition community about the role of sodium, how much you need. The extreme views on that are, some people are kind of sodium evangelists who think you need tons of it all the time. Some people are complete non-believers who think you need none of it any of the time. And I think that the truth exists between those two continuums. maximums, and it's individual to each individual. Like, I'm someone who, through hard-won experience and an investigation, has learned that I need to take a considerable amount of sodium with the fluids that I drink in long, hot events, otherwise I will fall apart. Other athletes need less, and that's probably primarily due to the fact that they lose less. So it's a case of experimenting with it and finding what works for you, and I think not getting drawn into this kind of polarized debate of whether electrolytes are, a completely made up thing by the sports nutrition industry or whether they're God's gift to endurance athletes.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's pause.
Yep.
And we'll see where I stand. We'll, I guess, reveal those results here.
Yeah, let's find out.
All right, stand by, everyone. Okay, results time. What did you find out about me?
Well, so Michael, you sort of predicted that you thought you were quite a salty sweater, like saltier than average, basically. And as an experienced endurance athlete, I would say that's a sign you know your body pretty well, because on the results, I can show you the screen here, we measured that you have about just under 1,300 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. And that range that I talked about, if we take 1,000 people and measure them, we'll find some people down at sort of 200, 300 milligrams per litre, very, very low salt sweaters. And I'm up at the higher end at over 1,800. We sometimes measure people over 2,000. The average is about 950 milligrams per litre, and yours is coming out about 1,200. So that would put you on the sort of just into the high category, as we would say. So I think that your personal experiences are probably quite consistent with what the results show here.
Cool. So what would an athlete do with this information? Like, how do they put it into practice?
So we would then, if they were working on their own, we would say you'd take this data and you could put it into the fuel and hydration planner on our website, and rather than guessing at your sweat sodium, you can put in an accurate result. You can also put in then the type of event, the intensity that you'll be working at, the environmental conditions, and it will use that as part of our algorithm to help guide you to look at roughly how much sodium you would be replacing per litre of fluid that you consume. And for you, that's going to be probably somewhere between 1,000. You would either be using the 1,000 milligram product that we have if you were going to use one of our products, if your event was on the shorter and lighter side, and if it was very, very hot and your sweat rate was very, very high, we'd probably be pushing you up towards the 1,500 milligram product for the majority of what you're drinking.
Gotcha. But the results are product agnostic. In other words, if you kind of can figure out how to count sodium by milligrams and do water, you could take these results and apply them.
Use it with a drink you're making yourself, with an amount of salt tablets you're taking, with someone else's products. Yeah, the result is then, it's part of the toolkit that you can then use to dial in your plan from there going forward.
Are the results only intended for when you are active? What about when you are sedentary or just hanging around, day-to-day life? What happens then?
Yeah, generally speaking, this matters when you're active, because it matters when you're sweating a decent amount. If you're not particularly active as a person, it might be vaguely interesting to have this data, but it's not going to change your habit, so it shouldn't be used to change your habits. This is about guiding you for times when you're sweating heavily.
All right, Andy, it's been an education. I want to thank you for sharing the test with me and the results and all the information as well. And here's to knowing what's in our sweat, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's been a real pleasure to get to meet you in person and chat this through, and hopefully this information is useful going forward.
You're better than you think you are. You can do more than you think you can. Dig deep, dig deep.
Thanks again to Andy Blow of Precision Fuel and Hydration. I love how focused Andy is. He took a problem he was having and turned it into something all endurance athletes can benefit from.
Like Andy said, the answers in the sweat test can be applied with any hydration brand. If you want to stay in the ecosystem, well, then Precision Fuel and Hydration has some pretty great stuff. In addition to sodium tabs and drink mixes, they have gels and chews. The flavor choices are few because the flavor profile is quite mild. I love their 90-gram gel packs with a screw top. That's like 3 gels in one package. They even have a 300-gram pouch that can be poured into what looks like a water bottle and dispensed at will. That's easily enough to get you up and down Columbine, by the way. And Precision Fatty has this super tall water bottle that will fit in a standard bottle cage. I think the thing must be 30 ounces. It's just massive. So if you're a bottle person and you like to get all you can in a bottle cage, they've got a bottle for you.
Yep, they sure do. And Precision was in the feed zones last year, so they know what the Leadville racer needs. Okay, we hope we scratched that Leadville itch a little here. Again, sorry for taking so long to get back to you. Good luck in your training, and we'll see you soon at the starting line.